Whenever blood spills on its freezing streets, Chicago has a habit of turning a blind eye. Staggering into a neon-lit diner with 2 hollow-point bullets in his chest, the undisputed head of the Castiglione syndicate found no mercy from the late-night patrons. They simply ran. They stepped over his dying body to save themselves, terrified of the shadows that hunted him. As he bled out on the cracked linoleum, watching his billion-dollar empire fade into dark obscurity, he accepted his lonely, violent fate. Defying every unspoken rule of the underworld, however, a 22-year-old waitress with nothing to her name dropped to her knees. She pressed her bare hands against the wound that was supposed to end his life, sparking a violently beautiful and completely unbelievable collision of 2 entirely different worlds. The neon sign outside Patsy's diner flickered with a desperate, dying hum, casting long, erratic pink shadows across the wet asphalt of 43rd Street. Inside, Ruby Jenkins was aggressively scrubbing down booth number 4, her muscles aching with the familiar, dull exhaustion of a double shift. The diner smelled of stale grease, burnt filter coffee, and cheap bleach, a scent that had permeated Ruby's clothes and hair for the last 3 years. She was exhausted, her mind preoccupied with the final notice she had received from Memorial Hospital that morning. Her younger brother, Leo, needed a 3rd surgery for his congenital heart defect, and Ruby was exactly $45,000 short. It was 2:14 a.m. The diner was mostly empty, save for a tired truck driver nursing a black coffee and a couple of college kids sharing a plate of cold fries in the corner. Then, the heavy glass door exploded inward. It wasn't shattered by a brick, but by the sheer force of a man throwing his entire failing weight against it. The chimes above the door shrieked as the man stumbled inside, collapsing heavily against the counter before sliding down to the checkered linoleum floor. Ruby froze, the damp rag slipping from her fingers. The man was dressed in a bespoke charcoal wool suit that probably cost more than Ruby's annual rent, but the pristine fabric was ruined. A dark, terrifyingly fast-spreading stain was blossoming across his white dress shirt just below his collarbone, and another at his side. He was gasping, his breath a wet, rattling sound. Panic erupted instantly. The truck driver bolted out the side exit without a word. The college kids scrambled over their booth, abandoning their coats in their frantic rush to escape the imminent violence they knew followed a man shot in the south side. Within 10 seconds, Ruby was the only person left in the diner with the dying stranger. She stood frozen behind the counter. Every survival instinct she had honed living in this city screamed at her to run, to lock herself in the walk-in freezer, to hide. The man rolled his head against the base of the counter. His face was unnervingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic cheekbones and jet-black hair plastered to his forehead with cold sweat. But it was his eyes that caught her, piercing, icy blue, dilated with shock but entirely devoid of fear. He looked at her. He didn't ask for help. He just looked at her with a chilling acceptance of his own end. This was Paul Castiglione. Even Ruby, who actively avoided the local news, recognized the face of the man who ran the city's docks, the unions, and the underground casinos. He was a ghost, a myth, a monster in a tailored suit, and he was dying on her freshly mopped floor. "Don't!" he choked out, coughing up a spatter of crimson. "Don't get involved. Run!" Ruby stared at the blood pooling on the linoleum. She thought of Leo, lying in a sterile hospital bed, entirely dependent on her. If she got involved with the mob, she could be killed. If she ran, a man would die alone on the floor. She didn't think. She just moved. Ruby vaulted over the counter, landing hard on her knees beside him. "Shut up!" she snapped, her voice trembling but remarkably authoritative. She ripped off her thick canvas diner apron, balling it up. "Press this," she commanded, taking his large, cold hand and forcing it over the wound on his chest. She then tore off her uniform shirt, leaving her in just her white undershirt, and shoved the fabric hard against the second bullet hole at his side. Paul let out a low, guttural groan, his eyes rolling back. "Hey, stay with me, damn it!" Ruby yelled, using her entire body weight to apply pressure. "You do not get to die on my shift. The paperwork will be a nightmare." A weak, blood-stained smirk touched Paul's lips. "You're crazy." Suddenly, the screech of tires echoed from the street outside. Two black, unmarked sedans halted violently in front of the diner. Car doors slammed. Paul's icy eyes snapped open, a flash of pure dread crossing his face. "Silas's men," he whispered, his grip on her wrist tightening with shocking strength. "Leave me. They'll kill you." "I'm not leaving you," Ruby breathed, her mind racing. "Can you move?" "We have 3 seconds." "Barely." "Get up." Ruby hoisted him by his good arm, her small frame straining under his immense weight. She dragged him behind the heavy wooden prep counter, pushing him back into the shadows near the dishwashing station. "Stay down." "Don't breathe," she hissed. Ruby sprinted back to the front. She grabbed the industrial mop bucket, kicked over the wet floor sign, and began frantically sloshing bleach-heavy water over the pool of blood, diluting the red into a pale, soapy pink just as the diner bell chimed. 3 men walked in. They wore dark coats, their hands resting ominously in their pockets. The leader, a man with a scarred jaw and dead eyes, scanned the empty diner. Ruby stood by the mop bucket, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She forced her hands to stop shaking, leaning on the mop handle, her undershirt clinging to her with sweat. "We're closed," Ruby said, her voice dropping an octave to mask her terror. The leader stepped forward, his boots squelching on the wet floor. He looked at the pinkish water. "We saw a man come in here, bleeding." "A lot of people come in here," Ruby lied smoothly, staring him dead in the eye. "A guy busted through the door a minute ago, knocked over my mop bucket, took one look at me screaming I was calling the cops and ran out the back exit." She pointed a shaky finger toward the alley door. "If he's bleeding, he's probably bleeding in the dumpster by now." The man stared at her, his gaze lingering on her bare arms and the stained undershirt. He stepped closer, the smell of gunpowder radiating off him. He leaned over the counter, peering toward the kitchen. In the shadows, Paul held his breath, his hand clutching a heavy cast-iron skillet Ruby had left on the rack. If the man took one more step, Paul would have to fight, and in his condition, he would lose. "Boss!" one of the other men called out from the back exit, having nudged it open. "Footprints in the mud leading to the street. Looks like he hopped the fence." The leader glared at Ruby for one more agonizing second before nodding. "Let's go. He won't make it far." They turned and walked out, the door chiming merrily behind them. Ruby waited until the taillights faded down the avenue. Then her knees buckled. She collapsed against the counter, gasping for air, sliding down to the floor where Paul was hidden. He was looking at her, his chest heaving, his icy blue eyes wide with an emotion he hadn't felt in a decade. Absolute, profound awe. "Phone," he managed to whisper, reaching into his bloody jacket pocket and pulling out a sleek, encrypted burner phone. "Dial. The first number. Tell them. Dom is at Patsy's." Ruby took the phone with trembling, blood-stained fingers. As she dialed, Paul Castiglione let his head fall back against the wall, his eyes fixed on the waitress who had just saved the life of the most dangerous man in Chicago. 10 minutes later, the diner was swarmed, not by the police, but by men in sharp suits, moving with terrifying, silent efficiency. Ruby watched from the corner, clutching a fresh towel, as a man introduced as Enzo, a towering figure with a gentle voice and ruthless eyes, directed a private medical team to stabilize Paul on the floor. As they lifted Paul onto a covert stretcher, he weakly raised a hand, stopping the paramedics. His icy blue eyes found Ruby in the dim light. "Enzo," Paul rasped, his voice barely audible over the rain. Enzo leaned down. "Yes, boss." "Leave her out of this. But find out everything." Before Ruby could process what that meant, they were gone. The only proof that the night had happened was the lingering smell of copper and the roll of $100 bills Enzo had quietly placed next to the cash register before walking out. For the next 4 days, Ruby tried to convince herself it was a fever dream. She scrubbed the diner, went home to her cramped one-bedroom apartment, and visited St. Jude's Medical Center. Leo was pale, hooked up to a dozen monitors. At 12 years old, he had spent more time in hospitals than in school. Sitting by his bed, Ruby stroked his hair, the crushing weight of reality settling back onto her shoulders. The hospital's billing department had left 3 voicemails. The deadline for the surgical deposit was Friday. It was Wednesday. "You look tired, Ruby," Leo murmured, his voice fragile. "Just working extra shifts, buddy," she lied, smiling warmly. "I'm invincible, don't you worry." She left the hospital at dusk, the cold November wind biting through her thin coat. As she walked past the hospital's administrative wing, a woman in a sharp navy blazer stepped out of an office, calling her name. "Miss Jenkins, do you have a moment?" Ruby braced herself. "I know I missed the deadline. I'm trying to secure a loan." "No, Miss Jenkins, you misunderstand," the administrator said, her expression a mix of professional courtesy and utter bewilderment. "Your brother's account, it's been cleared." Ruby stopped breathing. "Cleared? What do you mean?" "The entire balance. $45,000 for the past debt, plus an additional $100,000 deposited into a trust for his upcoming surgery and recovery care. It was wired this morning." Ruby gripped the edge of the reception desk. "By who?" "A corporate entity. Silverstone Holdings. We tried to reach out to thank them, but it's a blind trust. I thought perhaps you had a benefactor." Ruby walked out of the hospital in a daze. The streets of Chicago blurred around her. Silverstone. Silver. Cold. Hard. She turned down her street, a quiet, run-down block in the south side. As she approached her apartment building, she noticed it. A sleek, midnight black Lincoln Continental parked under the flickering street lamp. It looked like a shark swimming in a dirty fish tank. As she drew closer, the back door swung open. A man stepped out, leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane. It was him. Paul Castiglione looked vastly different than the bleeding, dying man on her diner floor. He wore a tailored black cashmere overcoat, his jaw clean-shaven, his dark hair immaculately styled. Though he was visibly pale and moved with stiff, guarded pain, he radiated an aura of absolute power and control. Behind him, Enzo stood silently by the driver's side. Ruby stopped 10 feet away, her heart hammering. "You shouldn't be out of bed," she blurted out. It was the only thing her shocked brain could produce. A genuine, startlingly handsome smile broke across Paul's stoic face. "Good evening to you too, Ruby." She flinched. "You know my name." "I know everything about you, Ruby Jenkins," Paul said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that sent a shiver down her spine. "I know you work 60 hours a week at Patsy's. I know you dropped out of nursing school to take care of your little brother. And I know you make an incredibly effective makeshift tourniquet." Ruby crossed her arms, trying to ward off the cold and her own rising anxiety. "The hospital bill. That was you." It was the least I could do, Paul replied, taking a slow step forward. You gave me my life. Money is an insignificant trade for that. I don't want your money, Ruby said fiercely, though tears of relief pricked her eyes. I saved you because it was the right thing to do, not for a payout. I don't want to owe the mob anything. Paul's expression softened, a flash of genuine respect in his icy eyes. You misunderstand the dynamics of this situation, Ruby. You don't owe me anything. I owe you a life debt. In my world, that is a sacred bond. Your world is exactly what I want to stay away from. I am afraid that is no longer entirely possible, Paul said, his tone turning serious, the warmth vanishing. He gestured for Enzo, who stepped forward with a thick manila envelope. The men who came into the diner that night, they didn't buy your story. Not entirely. Word has reached my ears that they are looking for the waitress who was working the graveyard shift at Patsy's. Ruby's blood ran cold. What? My underboss, Silas Moretti, ordered the hit on me. He is currently searching for any loose ends before he makes another move. You are a loose end, Ruby. Paul stepped closer, towering over her, his presence enveloping her like a dark, protective shadow. I protect what is mine, and right now, keeping you alive is my absolute priority. I'm not yours, Ruby shot back, lifting her chin defiantly. Paul's eyes darkened, dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before meeting her gaze again. The air between them suddenly felt thick, crackling with an undeniable, terrifying electricity. We can argue semantics later, Paul murmured. Pack a bag. You and your brother are moving. Moving where? Somewhere Silas can't reach you. With me. The penthouse at the top of the Castiglione Tower was a fortress disguised as a glass and marble palace. For 2 weeks, Ruby lived suspended in the clouds, far above the gritty streets she knew. Leo had been moved to a private, state-of-the-art medical suite on the east wing of the building, tended to by Paul's private physicians, including Dr. Samuel Aris, a brilliant surgeon who operated strictly off the grid. Ruby felt like a bird trapped in a gilded cage. Paul was a phantom in his own home. She would see him in his study late at night, poring over documents, surrounded by his lieutenants. He was waging a silent, invisible war against Silas Moretti, systematically dismantling the traitor's network, while pretending he was still recovering in secret. But amidst the chaos of his underworld war, Paul always found time for Ruby. They began sharing late-night meals in the massive kitchen. Ruby, sick of the private chef's pretentious food, had taken to cooking midnight comfort meals. Paul, the ruthless Mafia boss, would sit at the granite island, eating grilled cheese sandwiches and listening intently as Ruby talked about her dreams of finishing nursing school. You're too soft for this world, Ruby, Paul told her one night, watching the way the dim pendant lights caught the golden hues in her messy hair. And you're too hard for it, Ruby replied, wiping the counter. She paused, looking at him. Why did Silas betray you? Paul sighed, pouring 2 fingers of amber bourbon into a crystal glass. Silas wanted to force an alliance with the O'Connor Syndicate. It would involve trafficking things through my docks that I absolutely forbid. Weapons are one thing. Human lives are another. I refused. He decided new leadership was required. Ruby looked at him, realizing the moral code that existed within this dark man. He was a criminal, yes, but he had lines he would not cross. It made her heart ache in a way that terrified her. He thinks you're dead? Ruby asked. He thinks I am dying, Paul corrected, standing up and walking around the island until he was mere inches from her. He smelled of expensive cologne, bourbon, and danger. But tomorrow night, that changes. The annual Vanguard Charity Gala is tomorrow. All the families will be there. Silas will be there, preparing to formally announce his assumption of my seat. Paul reached out, his knuckles gently brushing against Ruby's cheek. She gasped softly at the touch, her breath hitching. "I am going to walk into that ballroom," Paul whispered, his eyes locked on hers. "And I am going to watch the color drain from his face." He paused, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "And I need you to walk in with me." Ruby's eyes widened. "Me? Why me? I don't belong there. I don't even own a dress that doesn't smell like diner coffee." "You belong wherever I am," Paul stated, a fierce possessiveness lacing his tone. "Silas knows a waitress saved me. He knows I hid you away. If I walk in alone, he will know I am still hiding, still vulnerable. If I walk in with you on my arm, dressed like a queen, it sends a message. It says I am untouchable. And so are you." The next evening, Ruby stared at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror of her suite. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. Enzo had brought in a team of stylists. She was wearing a breathtaking, floor-length gown of emerald green silk that clung to her curves and dipped low in the back. Her hair was swept up in an elegant cascade, and a diamond necklace, heavier than her life savings, rested against her collarbone. A knock sounded at the door. Paul walked in. He was wearing a bespoke black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. The cane was gone. He was pushing through the pain through sheer willpower. When he saw Ruby, he stopped dead in his tracks, the breath visibly caught in his throat. For a long moment, the ruthless mob boss was completely speechless. "Paul?" Ruby asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Is it too much?" "You are." Paul stepped toward her, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't hide. "You are spectacular, Ruby, breathtaking." He offered her his arm. "Ready to face the wolves?" "Only if the biggest, baddest wolf is on my side," she replied, a nervous smile playing on her lips. "Always," he swore. The Vanguard Gala was held at the Chicago History Museum, the grand hall dripping in crystal chandeliers and deceit. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and dangerous secrets. When Paul Castiglione walked through the grand double doors with Ruby on his arm, the string quartet might as well have stopped playing. The silence that washed over the room was deafening. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Ruby held her head high, squeezing Paul's arm. She felt his muscles tense. Across the room, standing by the champagne fountain, was Silas Moretti. He was a handsome man, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. When he saw Paul, the champagne flute in his hand cracked under his sudden, vicious grip, spilling wine over his white cuffs. Paul didn't flinch. He led Ruby straight across the ballroom floor, parting the sea of Chicago's elite like Moses. "Paul," Silas said as they approached, recovering his composure with the slickness of a true sociopath. We were told you were on bed rest." "Indefinitely." "Reports of my demise were greatly exaggerated, Silas," Paul said smoothly, his voice echoing loudly enough for the surrounding bosses to hear. "A minor setback, thanks to the extraordinary care of my lovely companion." Silas's dark eyes slid to Ruby, examining her like a butcher appraises meat. "Ah, the miraculous waitress. You clean up nicely, my dear." Ruby felt a wave of nausea, but she remembered Paul's words. "Show no fear." "Thank you," she said, her voice dripping with icy politeness. "And you must be Silas. Paul has told me so much about your ambitions." Silas's jaw tightened. "Has he?" He looked back at Paul. "It's dangerous, bringing a civilian into our world, Dom, especially one with sick family members. Accidents happen." The threat was not veiled. It was a knife to the throat. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Paul stepped slightly in front of Ruby, shielding her from Silas. When Paul spoke, it was with the chilling, quiet authority of a man who held life and death in his hands. If so much as a shadow falls across her, or anyone she loves, Silas, Paul whispered, his eyes boring into his former friend, I won't just kill you. I will erase your entire bloodline from the history of this city. Enjoy the champagne. It's your last. Paul turned away, guiding Ruby toward the dance floor. The orchestra, sensing the tension, struck up a slow, haunting waltz. Paul pulled Ruby into his arms. He moved with grace despite his healing wounds, holding her close to his chest. You're shaking, he murmured into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. He threatened Leo, Ruby whispered back, burying her face into his lapel. He threatened my brother, Paul. He is a dead man walking, Paul promised fiercely, his hand pressing against the bare skin of her back, sending jolts of electricity through her veins. Tonight was about drawing him out. Now I know he's desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. As they swayed under the chandeliers, Ruby looked up into Paul's icy blue eyes. The line between the waitress and the mob boss was blurring, erasing itself with every step they took together. She had saved his life, but as she held on to him in a room full of monsters, she realized with terrifying clarity that he had just claimed hers. The Vanguard Gala had been a derubation of war, and in the days that followed, the Castiglione penthouse transformed from a luxurious sanctuary into a tactical command center. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the freezing, steel-gray expanse of Lake Michigan were heavily tinted and reinforced with ballistic glass. Down in the streets of Chicago, the invisible war had gone loud. Safe houses belonging to Silas Moretti were mysteriously catching fire, and his illicit shipments at the Navy Pier docks were being intercepted and dumped into the icy waters by Enzo's strike teams. Yet, inside the penthouse, Ruby felt a suffocating, terrifying stillness. She spent her days oscillating between the East Wing, where Leo was rapidly gaining color and strength under the watchful eye of Dr. Samuel Aris, and the massive mahogany-lined library where she tried to lose herself in books. But her mind was never on the pages. It was always on the man who was currently tearing the city apart to keep her safe. It was a Tuesday night, shortly after 1 a.m., when the heavy oak doors of the library groaned open. Ruby looked up from the leather armchair by the fireplace. Paul stood in the doorway, looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him. He had discarded his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension and dusted with dark hair. The faint shadow of a beard darkened his sharp jawline. He moved with a slight limp, a grim reminder of the hollow point bullets that had nearly claimed his life on her diner floor just weeks ago. You should be resting, Ruby said softly, setting her book down. Paul rubbed the back of his neck, his icy blue eyes finding hers through the dim light of the dying fire. Sleep is a luxury I cannot afford right now, Ruby. Silas has gone to ground. He's reaching out to the Russian syndicates in Brighton Beach for backing. If he secures their muscle, this war will spill into the public eye. He walked over to the antique crystal decanter on the side table, pouring himself a generous measure of scotch. He didn't drink it immediately. Instead, he stared into the amber liquid as if searching for answers. Ruby stood up, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. She wore a simple silk robe, a gift from Enzo's stylists, that felt too luxurious for a girl who used to count pennies for bus fare. She approached Paul slowly, intuitively sensing the heavy burden crushing his broad shoulders. "You're bleeding," she murmured, her eyes catching a faint red bloom seeping through the white fabric of his shirt, just over his ribs. Paul glanced down, his expression indifferent. "I tore a stitch. It's nothing." Tommy Callahan and I had to send a rather physical message to one of Silas's lieutenants down by the rail yards. "Sit down," Ruby commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. It was the same authoritative voice she had used that night at Patsy's diner. A faint, tired smile touched Paul's lips, and for a moment the ruthless mob boss vanished, leaving behind a man who was deeply, profoundly weary. He complied, sinking heavily into a tufted leather sofa. Ruby retrieved the medical kit Dr. Aris had left in the adjoining bathroom. When she returned, she knelt between Paul's parted knees. "Shirt off," she instructed. Paul complied silently, his eyes never leaving her face. As the fabric fell away, Ruby inhaled sharply. It wasn't just the fresh, angry red of the torn stitches over his ribcage. His torso was a map of old violence. Pale, jagged scars crisscrossed his skin, memories of knife fights, bullet grazes, and betrayals. It was the body of a man who had fought for every inch of his empire. Her hands trembled slightly as she applied an antiseptic wipe to the torn stitch. Paul hissed, his muscles jumping under her touch. "Sorry," she whispered, her voice incredibly close to him. "Don't be," Paul replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Pain keeps me awake, keeps me sharp." "You don't have to carry all of this alone, Paul," Ruby said, carefully applying a fresh butterfly bandage over the wound. She kept her eyes focused on her task, terrified of what she might see if she looked up, terrified of what he might see in her. Paul reached out, his large, warm hand catching her chin and gently forcing her to look up at him. His icy eyes were dark, swirling with an intensity that made Ruby's breath catch in her throat. "In my world, Ruby, sharing the burden means making someone else a target," he said softly, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. "When I saw you standing in front of Silas at the Vanguard Gala, looking at him with absolutely no fear, I realized something terrifying." "What?" Ruby breathed, entirely paralyzed by his proximity. "I realized that I would burn this entire city to ash before I let anyone touch you," Paul confessed, the raw, violent honesty of his words echoing in the quiet room. "You were supposed to be a temporary guest, a debt repaid, but now you are the only light in this God-forsaken dark I live in." Ruby's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew she should pull away. He was danger incarnate. He was the underworld, but looking into his eyes, she only saw the man who had anonymously paid her brother's medical debts, the man who listened to her fears, the man who was bleeding to keep them safe. "Paul." He didn't let her finish. Paul leaned down, closing the fraction of an inch between them, and pressed his mouth to hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of desperation, fear, and undeniable searing heat. Ruby gasped against his lips, her hands instinctively flying up to tangle in his dark hair as he pulled her flush against his chest, ignoring the pain of his torn stitches. He tasted of expensive scotch and raw, untamed power. Ruby surrendered to it entirely, kissing him back with a fierce, answering hunger that surprised them both. For a breathless eternity, the war outside didn't exist. There was only the firelight, the frantic beating of their hearts, and the terrifying realization that they had just crossed a line from which neither could ever return. Then, the shrill, ear-piercing shriek of the penthouse security alarm shattered the silence. The romantic haze evaporated in an instant. Paul tore himself away, his eyes instantly hardening into chips of blue ice. The ambient lighting in the library snapped off, replaced by the pulsing, ominous rotation of red emergency strobes. "What is that?" Ruby panicked, scrambling to her feet. Paul was already moving, grabbing a heavy Glock 19 from a hidden compartment under the mahogany end table. He racked the slide with a terrifying, practiced swiftness. "Perimeter breach," he barked, his voice devoid of all warmth. He pressed a button on his encrypted earpiece. "Enzo, report." A moment of static, then Enzo's voice crackled through, tight with urgency. "Boss, they bypassed the lobby security grid. Heavy armament. They took out the private elevator guards. They aren't coming up the main shaft." Paul's face went deadly pale. He looked at Ruby, sheer terror flashing in his eyes for the first time since she had met him. "The service elevators," Paul realized, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "They lead directly to the east wing." "Leo." Ruby didn't wait for Paul's orders. The instinct that had driven her to save a bleeding stranger on a diner floor now propelled her with explosive force. She bolted out of the library, sprinting barefoot down the long, sprawling corridor that connected the main penthouse to the medical suite. "Ruby, stop!" Paul roared behind her, his heavy footsteps pounding on the hardwood. But his injuries slowed him down just enough. The red emergency light strobed rhythmically, casting nightmarish shadows across the pristine white walls of the east wing. Ruby rounded the corner, her lungs burning, just in time to see the heavy steel doors of the service elevator slide open. 3 men stepped out. They wore tactical black gear, their faces obscured by ski masks, carrying suppressed submachine guns. They moved with military precision, immediately fanning out down the corridor. Ruby threw herself behind a heavy marble pillar, just as a suppressed burst of gunfire shattered the glass partition of the nurses' station 20 feet away. Dr. Orris, who had been reviewing charts, dove behind the counter with a shout. The hitmen weren't there for Paul. Silas was a coward. He knew Paul's penthouse was a fortress, but he also knew where Paul's new, glaring weakness lay. They were here for the boy. "Room 4, one of the masked men grunted, pointing his weapon toward the heavy wooden door at the end of the hall. "Leo's room." "No, not him. You will not touch him." Ruby felt a surge of adrenaline so pure and violent it entirely erased her fear. She looked around frantically. Next to her pillar was a heavy, stainless steel rolling cart loaded with surgical equipment and heavy, pressurized oxygen tanks. The lead hitman was 5 feet away, his back turned to her as he stalked toward Leo's door. Ruby didn't think. She lunged from behind the pillar, grabbing the handle of the medical cart, and shoved it with every ounce of strength in her body. The heavy metal cart slammed violently into the hitman's knees, sending him crashing to the polished marble floor with a sickening crunch. His gun clattered away. "Hey!" the second man yelled, spinning toward Ruby and raising his weapon. Before he could pull the trigger, a deafening roar echoed through the corridor. It wasn't a suppressed weapon. It was the explosive, thunderous boom of Paul's Glock. The second hitman's head snapped back in a spray of crimson, and he collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. Paul stepped into the corridor, moving with the cold, methodical grace of an apex predator. He didn't say a word. He fired twice more. 2 rapid, perfectly placed shots that hit the third man squarely in the chest, dropping him instantly. The first man, still entangled in the medical cart, scrambled for his fallen weapon. Paul closed the distance in 3 massive strides. He kicked the gun across the floor, then planted his heavy boot firmly on the man's throat, pinning him to the marble. Enzo and 4 of Paul's elite guards flooded into the hallway from the opposite end, their weapons drawn, sweeping the area. "Clear!" Enzo shouted, his eyes wide as he surveyed the carnage. Paul didn't look at his men. He pressed his boot harder against the hitman's windpipe, his icy blue eyes completely devoid of mercy. "Who gave you the access codes to the service elevator?" Paul demanded, his voice a lethal, vibrating hiss. The man choked, clawing uselessly at Paul's leg. "Go to hell." Paul didn't blink. He raised his weapon and aimed it directly at the man's knee. I am already there, and I hold the keys. Bang! The hitman screamed, an agonizing, blood-curdling sound that echoed off the pristine walls. Ruby flinched, covering her mouth with her hands, staring in horror. She had known Paul was a Mafia boss. She knew he ordered violence. But seeing the ruthless, unflinching brutality with which he operated, shook her to her core. "I'll ask one last time," Paul said smoothly, leveling the gun at the man's other knee. "Marco!" the man shrieked, weeping openly. "Marco from the IT division. Silas bought him off. Please!" Paul nodded slowly. "Enzo, find Marco. Take him to the warehouse." He stepped back, holstering his weapon. "Clean this mess up." Paul finally turned. The cold, murderous mask vanished the second his eyes locked onto Ruby. She was pressed against the wall, trembling violently, her chest heaving as she stared at the blood pooling on the white marble floor. "Ruby," Paul breathed, closing the distance between them. He reached for her, his large hands gently gripping her shoulders. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" Ruby shook her head rapidly, her wide eyes darting from Paul to the bodies on the floor. "Leo!" she choked out. Paul immediately pushed past her, throwing open the door to room 4. Ruby rushed in behind him. Leo was sitting up in bed, clutching his blankets, his monitors beeping erratically, his eyes wide with terror. But he was physically unharmed. "Ruby!" Leo cried out. Ruby ran to the bed, throwing her arms around her brother, burying her face in his neck as a sob finally tore free from her throat. She held him as tightly as she could, rocking him back and forth. Paul stood in the doorway watching them. His hands were shaking. He had nearly lost them. Because of him, the innocent boy and the woman he was falling in love with had almost been slaughtered in his own home. He stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind him to give them privacy. He leaned heavily against the wall, the adrenaline fading, leaving him hollow and agonizingly aware of his torn stitches. Enzo approached quietly. "The perimeter is secure, boss. We have Marco in custody. What are your orders?" Paul stared at the bloodstains on the floor, his jaw tight. He loved Ruby. He knew that now, with an absolute, terrifying certainty. And because he loved her, he knew exactly what he had to do. "Prepare the Gulf Stream jet," Paul said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Enzo frowned. "Sir? Where are we going?" "Not we. Them," Paul replied, his eyes fixed on the closed door of Leo's room. "First thing tomorrow morning, you are flying Ruby and Leo to the estate in Sicily. Put 100 guards on the perimeter. No one goes in, no one comes out." "Dom," Enzo said softly, dropping the formalities. "She won't want to leave you." "It doesn't matter what she wants," Paul said harshly, though his eyes betrayed his agony. "Silas just proved that nowhere in Chicago is safe. I brought her into this darkness, Enzo. I have to get her out before it consumes her." Paul pushed himself off the wall, walking toward the main penthouse, preparing to break his own heart in order to save hers. He had to send her away, finish this bloody war, and hope that one day she might forgive him for it. The morning sun over Lake Michigan was the color of a bruised plum, casting a cold, unforgiving light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Ruby stood completely still, staring at the sleek black duffel bags placed neatly by the mahogany double doors. Paul stood 10 feet away, buttoning a fresh charcoal suit jacket over his freshly bandaged torso. His face was an impenetrable mask of carved stone. The terrifying vulnerability she had witnessed in the library hours ago was entirely gone, locked away behind the icy blue eyes of a ruthless syndicate boss. "The motorcade is waiting downstairs," Paul stated, his voice devoid of any inflection. Enzo will personally escort you and Leo to O'Hare. My private Gulf Stream is fueled and cleared for takeoff. You will be in Palermo by midnight." Ruby crossed her arms, her fingernails digging into the sleeves of her sweater. "You're just sending us away. Just like that." "I am securing my assets," Paul corrected coldly, though a tiny muscle twitching in his jaw betrayed his forced apathy. "Silas has proven he can reach the East Wing. I will not allow you or the boy to be used as leverage. It is a tactical necessity." "Tactical necessity," Ruby repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She walked toward him, her anger finally breaking through her fear. "I am not a chess piece, Paul, and you are not a machine. You are walking into a trap and you know it." Paul looked away, staring out at the Chicago skyline. "Silas requested a parley at the abandoned St. Jude shipping yards. Just him and me. It is the only way to end this without tearing the city in half." "It's an ambush," Ruby pleaded, reaching out to grab his arm. "He sent hitmen to kill a child last night. He doesn't play by your rules." "I know," Paul said softly. He finally turned to look at her, and the raw, agonizing grief in his eyes made Ruby's breath catch. He reached up, his rough knuckles brushing against her cheek one last time. "That is exactly why you cannot be here. If I know you are safe, I can do what needs to be done. Forgive me, Ruby." Before she could argue further, he turned on his heel and walked out the door, flanked by Tommy Callahan and 3 heavily armed guards. An hour later, Ruby sat in the back of a reinforced SUV parked on the freezing tarmac at O'Hare International Airport. Leo was already asleep on the jet, exhausted by the stress of the night and heavily medicated for the flight. Standing outside the open door of the SUV was Enzo. The towering underboss was conducting a final perimeter check, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Ruby watched him closely. She had noticed the faded, dark ink peeking out from beneath his cuffs, the unmistakable trident tattoo of a Navy SEAL. Enzo wasn't just a mob enforcer. He was a highly trained military operative, a man built for warfare. Ruby made a decision. She pushed the heavy door of the SUV open and stepped out onto the freezing tarmac. "Enzo." He turned, his expression respectful but firm. "Miss Jenkins, you need to board the aircraft. We have a narrow flight window." "You're not getting on the plane, are you?" Ruby asked, staring him down. Enzo hesitated, his jaw tightening. "My orders are to ensure your safe departure, Ma'am. Then I am to return to the city." "To pick up the pieces," Ruby realized, her voice trembling. "Or to collect his body. You know the shipping yards are a kill zone. You know Silas has the high ground." "Dom is a billionaire with limitless resources, Ruby. He knows what he is walking into," Enzo replied, using her first name for the first time. "He ordered me to protect you. And what good is protecting me if the man who saved my brother's life dies today?" Ruby took a step closer to the towering former SEAL. "You swore an oath to your country once, Enzo. Now you swore an oath to him. Are you really going to let your commanding officer walk into a slaughter alone?" Enzo stared at the 22-year-old waitress. She was shaking from the freezing wind, but her eyes burned with an unyielding, fierce defiance. She was right, and every military instinct screaming in his blood knew it. Enzo pulled out his encrypted radio. "Flight crew, prep the boy for takeoff. Wheels up in 2 minutes. Seal the cabin." Ruby frowned. "Wait, I'm not leaving." "You are leaving," Enzo snapped, his voice suddenly taking on the hardened, commanding edge of a military squad leader. "Because if you stay, Paul will hesitate, and that will get him killed. I am putting you on this plane, Ruby. But you are absolutely right about one thing." Enzo pulled a heavy, matte black Sig Sauer from his shoulder holster and checked the chamber. I don't let my brothers die alone. The St. Jude shipping yards were a sprawling, rusting graveyard of steel containers and broken cranes on the edge of the industrial district. The wind howled off the icy lake, carrying the scent of salt and decay. Paul Castiglione stood entirely alone in the center of the muddy lot. He leaned slightly on his silver-handled cane, his tailored black overcoat billowing in the wind. 100 yards away, the heavy iron doors of a rusted warehouse groaned open. Silas Moretti walked out, flanked by 24 men armed with military-grade rifles. They fanned out, completely surrounding Paul in a wide, inescapable circle. Silas smirked, stopping 20 feet away. I have to admit, Dom, I didn't think you'd actually come. A billionaire kingpin walking into the mud to die. It's almost poetic. You violated the most sacred law we have, Silas, Paul said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the freezing wind. You targeted a child. You targeted innocent blood. Innocent? Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. There is no innocence in Chicago, Dom. You grew soft. You started caring about the dock workers, the unions, the collateral damage. You became a businessman instead of a boss. I'm just taking out the trash. Silas raised his hand, signaling his men to raise their weapons. A dozen red laser sights painted Paul's chest. Any last words, boss? Silas sneered. Paul didn't flinch. He didn't beg. Instead, a cold, terrifying smile touched his lips. You think you bought an army, Silas, but you forgot one crucial detail. You are dealing with a billionaire. Silas frowned. What? Paul reached into his overcoat and pulled out his sleek black phone. I didn't come here to fight your mercenaries, Silas. I came here to outbid you. He pressed a single button on his screen. Instantly, the cell phones of every single mercenary surrounding them chimed in unison. The armed men looked at their screens. Their offshore accounts had just been credited with $2 million each. The condition of the wire transfer was absolute neutrality. The leader of the mercenaries, a scarred man with a heavy Russian accent, lowered his rifle. He looked at Silas, then at Paul, and gave a curt nod. Without a word, the 24 men turned on their heels and began walking away toward the perimeter fence, abandoning Silas completely. Silas's face drained of color. Pure, unadulterated panic set in. Wait, I can double it! Stop! But they were gone. Silas was left standing in the mud with only 4 of his loyal, personal bodyguards. Kill him! Silas shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Paul. Before the bodyguards could even raise their weapons, the deafening crack of a high-powered sniper rifle echoed from the top of a rusting crane. One of Silas's guards dropped instantly. A second later, a flashbang grenade plummeted from the sky, detonating between Silas and his remaining men with a blinding, concussive roar. Out of the shadows of the containers emerged Enzo, moving with the terrifying, lethal precision of a Tier 1 operator. He didn't waste movements. 3 suppressed shots, and the remaining 3 bodyguards were neutralized before the smoke even cleared. Silas, deafened and blinded by the flashbang, stumbled backward into the mud. He scrambled desperately for the pistol at his waist, but a heavy boot slammed down on his wrist, shattering the bone with a sickening crack. Silas screamed in agony, looking up into the icy, unforgiving eyes of Paul Castiglione. Paul leveled his Glock directly at Silas's forehead. You wanted the throne, Silas. Look where it got you, groveling in the dirt. Do it. Silas spat blood onto the mud, glaring up with pure hatred. Shoot me. Be the monster everyone knows you are. Paul stared at the traitor. His finger tightened on the trigger. He could end it right now. A single bullet, and the man who had ordered a hit on Ruby and Leo would be dead. But then, Paul thought of Ruby. He thought of the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes, The way she had demanded he be better than the darkness surrounding him. If he executed Silas in cold blood, he would never be able to wash the stain from his soul. He would never be worthy of a woman like her. Paul slowly lowered his gun. "Death is too easy for you, Silas," Paul whispered. "I believe in a harder karma." In the distance, the wail of dozens of sirens pierced the morning air. Red and blue lights began flashing across the rusted steel containers, completely surrounding the shipping yard. Silas's eyes widened in sheer horror. "The cops? You called the cops? You're breaking the code." "Not the police. The FBI," Paul corrected smoothly, stepping back. "While you were busy planning this ambush, Tommy was delivering 3 hard drives to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every ledger, every human trafficking route, every bribe you ever paid. You aren't going to die today, Silas. You are going to rot in a federal supermax prison for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life. And you will do it, knowing that you were beaten by a waitress and a ghost." As the FBI tactical teams swarmed the yard, screaming for everyone to get on the ground, Enzo grabbed Paul's shoulder, pulling him back into the shadows of a subterranean maintenance tunnel they had pre-cleared for extraction. The underworld kingpin vanished into the dark, leaving the traitor to face the brutal, uncompromising justice of the law. 6 months later, the neon lights of Patsy's diner were a distant, fading memory. Ruby Jenkins stood on the sun-drenched balcony of a sprawling historical villa in Palermo, Sicily, the warm Mediterranean breeze catching her hair. Inside, Leo was laughing, playing chess with Enzo, his heart strong and his future finally secure. Strong arms wrapped around Ruby from behind, pulling her back against a broad, solid chest. Paul buried his face in her neck, pressing a soft kiss to her skin. He had dismantled his criminal empire, leaving the darkness of Chicago behind to build a legitimate shipping conglomerate. He had traded his throne of blood for a chance at redemption. "What are you thinking about?" Paul murmured, holding her tightly. "Just how unbelievable life is." Ruby smiled, leaning back into the man she loved. She had dropped to her knees to save a dying mob boss, and in return, they had saved each other.